Hello my beauties, I hope that you've been well. In today's video, I am going to be taking you through the process of this new mixed media painting that I did. This concept is something that I've done in the past, and if you've been following me on Instagram for a little bit, you might have seen it before, and I just love it so much, so I thought I'd come back and revisit it. For this series, I used acrylic gouache, collage, and mirror relief on a wood panel to bring it all together. As always, all the art materials used will be listed in the description down below. To begin, whenever I paint on wood panels, I typically like to prep them by sanding the wood and coating it with clear gesso to prime the surface. After the first layer has dried, I sand and prime it again. I typically do this 2 to 3 times, and the reason I do this is so that the surface is nice and smooth, which allows the paint to adhere to the wood nicely and for an overall better painting experience in my opinion. Also, you could definitely use white gesso as well, which I often do, but I did opt for clear for this piece because I will actually be leaving some of the wood exposed for the final product. And as a side note, the clear gesso, it's kind of a milky consistency or look at first, and then when it dries, it'll be totally translucent. After I finished the sketch and decided on the colors digitally on my iPad using Procreate, I print out the sketch to the exact size of the wood panel, in this case 6 by 6 inches, and then I cut it out. Here I'll be showing you how I transfer a sketch onto a wood panel. Using a soft graphite pencil or graphite stick, the ones I have here are 6B, I flip the print over and coat the surface with the graphite, mainly focusing on the areas where the sketch is. Then, after I've covered the surface, I will tape it to the wood panel and trace out my sketch using a pen with fairly hard pressure. Basically, what we're doing is pressing the graphite into the wood surface to leave an imprint or impression of our sketch. Then, after I've finished tracing, I'll typically finesse the sketch since some information typically gets lost during the transfer. The transfer is more like a light blueprint for us to follow. I also like to use my kneadable eraser to lift some of the excess graphite so that it doesn't smudge and poorly interfere with the paint. Also, similar to my usual watercolor and gouache pieces, I opt for using a colored pencil for the final sketch because I find that it interacts with the paint better. Then from there, we can finally begin painting. As usual, I start with the skin first. If you've seen my previous acrylic gouache painting process video, you'll probably be familiar with some of my techniques already. Typically, I like to use fairly thin, watered down paint for the first few layers. Here, I start with a very light wash of a beige color for the base. In these early stages, I often try to paint around the sketch lines so that I don't cover them up right away. This is also part of the reason why I like to use diluted paint for these first layers as well, is because adding more water to your gouache will make it semi-translucent, which also allows your sketch to still be visible if you do end up going over the lines. However, I do recommend taking a photo of your sketch before you begin painting if you want that guide or reference point, as the lines will begin to get covered up by the paint. I, of course, have my original printed out sketch to work from, so I didn't need to worry about taking a photo in this case. Then, after that first layer, I mix more of the base skin tone color, adding a little bit more peach this time, and I mix up a pink color for the rosy/blush areas of the skin. For these mixtures, they are still diluted with a fair amount of water. And basically, I switch back and forth between these two colors as I paint the skin. I find that working this way allows me to blend the colors together fairly easily for that soft airbrush look. This series of paintings is inspired by Kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery by mending the areas of breakage with lacquer dusted or mixed with powdered gold. I just love the concept of mending something that is broken, but in the process, it ends up being more beautiful than it was previously. Plus, it is a great excuse for me to add in gold accents, which I think really bring these pieces to the next level. And as you can see here, I just keep using the same painting techniques with essentially the same two colors. But as each layer progresses, I use less and less water for the paint mixtures. That way the paint and the layers have more opacity and better coverage as we continue on with the painting. At this point, I knew I needed to let the skin layers dry before I put more layers on top, and since I had some leftover paint, I decided to use it to put a wash of color over the hair. I knew that this wasn't going to be anywhere close to the final color I wanted for the hair, but since this is acrylic gouache, I knew that the paint was just going to dry up in the palette anyway, so I figured, why not? While the majority of the watercolor papers I typically use are very heavy, it can handle lots of applications, there's something that I just really love about painting on wood panels. And I think it's just because they're so sturdy that I know I can use tons of water and many layers without worrying about the surface not being able to handle it. Then from there, I'm taking a break from painting the skin and moving on to the hair. This first mixture I found to be a bit warmer than I wanted, so after the first layer, I end up adding in more magenta and purple paint to give it a cooler hue. I find that the cooler hair color complements the cool pink in her skin a little better. Then I go ahead and use the same paint that I used for the hair to paint in the eyes and her eyebrows. By the way, this printed paper that I'm using in this piece is called Chiogami paper. It's this beautiful Japanese paper that has been hand produced by silk screening each layer to build the patterns. When I was in college, I worked at the local art supply store and I couldn't resist buying multiple variety packs of the cutoffs because I think typically they are printed in fairly large formats. And as usual, I had all these plans and ideas to use them, but I was overly precious about it and barely used them at all. So fast forward all these years later and I still have tons of it. So slowly but surely, I hope to finally give them some use because they are too beautiful to just sit around in my drawer hidden away. Then at this point in the piece, after adding in some highlighted areas, I used the hair color mixed in with some more pink for some of the more pronounced shadows for the skin. For this portrait, I wanted to go a little bit more stylized, so I didn't end up spending too much time rendering and blending the shadows. I decided to lean into the kind of more graphic look for it. Now that I feel like the skin is pretty much done, I move on to the line art. For the line work, I pretty much just use the same paint that I had used for the hair. This keeps all the colors harmonious with each other, plus I still had some paint left over anyways, so I might as well use it. I often get asked how I'm able to keep a steady hand for tiny, delicate areas like this. And honestly, I think it's basically a combination of resting my hand on the surface to keep my hand steady, but also just gripping the paintbrush for dear life and hoping for the best. Another benefit to working on a wood panel as opposed to paper is that, in my opinion, I feel like with a panel you don't necessarily need to frame it. So I think you can just hang it up as is. And because of that, I typically like to paint the sides a fun color as well. That way it's an extra pop of color, and I feel like it makes the piece more finished looking because it kind of looks like it is already framed. Then after that, I tape the edges of the surface so that I can paint in the background. Basically, I want there to be a kind of border around her that is the exposed wood. After satisfyingly peeling the tape back, we can move on to the Chiyogami paper. So first I trace out the shape that I need onto some tracing paper. Then I flip it and trace out the shape again onto the back side of the Chiyogami paper and cut out the shape. I did technically try to film this part, but I realized that I ended up being off camera. So after you've traced out the shape, we can cut these shapes out, and then from there we can glue it onto the wood panel. And basically just rinse and repeat for the rest of the shapes. And after all of the paper has been taped down, we move on to the finishing touches, which is where I add in the gold mirror. So the gold that I'll be showing you guys is a little bit different from your traditional gold leaf. So basically you carefully use the adhesive and squeeze out the glue onto the painting. Then you have to let it cure for about 15 minutes or longer so that it's slightly tacky and translucent. This part is pretty key because if you don't let it dry long enough, the gold won't stick properly. So as I'm letting it dry, I'm using my little white paint marker to add in the final little highlights. So basically, taking the gold sheet, you gently press it down onto the adhesive parts with the gold side facing up. Using very light pressure with my fingertips on all the areas, then we can peel it back and you can see that the gold is revealed. So satisfying, right? And also so much cleaner and easier to use, in my opinion, than gold leaf. And that pretty much sums up the video. I hope that this was a fun process for you guys to see. And if you decide to do something similar, feel free to tag me on Instagram. I'd love to see your collage or gold pieces as well. Anyways, love you guys. See you next time. Bye.